So we're going to do I Did Not Reach Thee in this class. So it's quite a nice little Dickinson poem, but it is difficult to understand. It took me a little while to get my head around this one because it's very abstract and symbolic. You might want to start by researching transcendentalism because it feels a lot like a transcendentalist poem. Dickinson herself borrowed from transcendentalism. We don't exactly call her a transcendentalist poet because she had a lot of different influences and she never quite settled into one exact way of being. That's why in some kind of critical modes she's called an atheist, and in others she's highly spiritual and religious. It's because she was a very kind of open-minded and exploratory of ideas without fully kind of pinning her identity down and committing to a single idea or identity or way of being. So she uses transcendentalism a lot in the poetry, and you can call it kind of transcendentalist ideas or transcendentalist influences rather than just saying she's a full-on transcendentalist like Emerson, for example. So it's got kind of these transcendental ideas of using nature and the world around us as symbolic of spirituality or metaphor for God or a metaphor for the soul, and seeing a connection between the way that we work internally as human beings and the way that the world works externally, and then the kind of spiritual religious mechanisms behind that connection as well. So, so with that in mind, we're going to have a look at the poem. If you take it too literally, as with a lot of Dickinson's poems, it doesn't quite make sense. So you don't want to think of it like literally she's just going on a journey. She's actually kind of going on a spiritual or metaphorical journey. So it starts with a negative, I did not reach thee, which is basically like, kind of quite a self-deprecating or kind of despondent tone. It's a lack of fulfillment, a lack of achievement of something. So it's possibly got, initially a sense of resentment there, a sense of sadness at not achieving a goal. But actually that transitions quite quickly into positivity. But my feet slip nearer every day. So even though I've not quite got there yet, I'm on this journey and I'm getting closer. So she turns a negative feeling round into a positive one. It's kind of a motivational poem in some ways, rather than a poem that's too despondent or too defeatist in its attitude. So then she uses these kind of landscapes as symbolic metaphors for the distance required for one soul or one individual to go and meet another. It may be literal. It may be that she's talking about someone who is physically, geographically far away from her, but it's likely that these are actually metaphors for the amount of growth and development and change and the journey that's required for one individual to fully meet another, to go and, kind of connect with their soul. So we have desert and a sea, we have rivers and a hill, things that are kind of fluid and symbolize water, liquid elements, also things that are more solid and symbolize earth elements. So the sense of desert also gives us a kind of temperature feeling to that. We've got heat, and then she also talks about coldness, the idea of the year being cold, even though there's two deserts that she crossed. A desert symbolically could also represent a kind of aridity where nothing grows. So maybe a period of drought, a period of lack of creativity, lack of growth. So you can kind of think about it in that way as well. Seas also can become kind of like, they represent sort of ripples, ups and downs, turbulence, kind of waves of things coming and going. Water is quite symbolically in poetry associated with emotion. So you might see her representation of the sea as something to do with fluctuating emotions. There's also a sense of light and darkness. The sun goes crooked, that is night before he makes the bend. So again, that transition from light to dark, and light again, also symbolic. If we interpret this as a religious poem, lightness is often characterized as symbolizing the presence of God or the presence of spirituality. and night or darkness is the presence of evil or lack of God. So it might be a fluctuation in her spiritual faith that she's talking about. And the thee of this poem, the addressee of this poem, you could interpret that as a deity, as a higher power. But she deliberately leaves it very ambiguous. So it might be a real person, might be geographically accurate, but it's likely to be symbolic. It's likely to either be somebody who she feels a very strong connection with, that she's trying to connect to, or possibly a more abstract concept like a higher power. I really like this line. So, we were further off, too great it seems, so near the hole to stand. And it's like about the, she kind of, I almost wish the end was longer away, because by the time I've done this giant journey, it seems like too much of a big thing for it to actually finally come to the end and for me to reach my goal. And it's a very good analysis of psychology and the psychological mechanisms that we have when you're trying to achieve something, and then when you finally get to a point where you're almost going to achieve it, it's almost like a feeling of self-sabotage, because you're so used to the actual working and the process. You don't want that to end almost. So yeah, it's quite funny, I think, sometimes the way that she conceptualizes those types of ideas. So yeah, a couple of things that are quite important about this poem, if we go a bit more into the language and the structure. There's a sort of consistent, focused attitude of the speaker offset against the fluctuations of the structure. So you'll notice the lines vary in length, the stanzas vary in length. There's no regularity to this poem, but there is a constant, which is the attitude and the focus and the resolve of the speaker. Even though she at times starts to doubt herself, she's still focused on this task of making this journey. And as with many of Dickinson's poems, the ending is also ambiguous. There's no kind of final comment that reveals everything, that sort of tells you how to be or how to think. And she says, death usurps my premium and gets the look at thee. So it's kind of the ending, the opening and ending are quite important with this poem. And so there's this feeling of death has usurped, death has kind of encroached and taken over, and has a look at whatever the subject of the poem is, whatever the addressee is. So it could be a person who's close to death, who Dickinson's trying to kind of preemptively process the fact that this person's not always going to be around. Or if you interpret it as a higher power, it could be that she feels like she's not made enough of a spiritual leap yet to fully meet God in heaven, and she's sort of going to die before she gets to that point. So there's sort of a double way of looking at it. When you do double interpretations with poems, it's always considered quite an advanced thing to do. So rather than being kind of stressed about, do I treat it as a real person or do I treat it as a god, you should just be able to kind of analyze interchangeably between those two things, depending on what your essay is or how you feel about it. So yeah, don't worry too much that there's no kind of direct answer with this one or with any of Dickinson's poems, because that's sort of part of understanding her as a person and connecting with her poetry. It also gets you higher grades in essays if you're aware of different lines of interpretation or different angles. So it's not a bad thing overall. It makes it more complicated, but then it pays off in the end. So yeah, in terms of like opinions that we have here that are quite interesting, we've got this feeling that death is sort of this final separator of relationships, or death kind of is almost an evil presence that gets in the way of happiness and connection between souls, which is really different in some ways to other poems that she does, like Because I Could Not Stop for Death. She gladly, the speaker in that one, goes along with death. So you might want to compare and contrast the presentation of death in this poem with other ones. There's also a sense that there's sort of like pure love is the driving force behind the speaker, which is why it doesn't quite matter who the addressee is. It could be a love interest in a romantic sense, it could be a family member or a close friend, or it could be an abstract representation of a deity, because the sort of the sense of love that the speaker feels is so strong and powerful. It motivates her and drives her forwards to make this journey. So contextually, the most important context point to think about with this poem is the idea of a pilgrimage. So a pilgrimage is when you make a spiritual journey for a specific purpose to kind of improve yourself or to improve your connection with something. It usually is a difficult journey to make a pilgrimage. So it takes kind of a lot of willpower, a lot of consistent effort, and you experience a lot of difficulties while you're going on a pilgrimage. But then you get the reward of when you arrive at your destination, you suddenly have this kind of transformative religious experience. So I feel like it's kind of drawing on and evoking motifs from the Bible. So we can call that biblical allegory. So there's the journey of the Israelites, for example, people who crossed the desert and the Red Sea, traveling under extreme pressure until they finally settled in their own holy land. So she might be saying, in order for her soul to fully have peace and to be happy, she needs to go on this difficult, turbulent, stressful journey. So if you want more information, a lot more detail on this one, you can go and download the document from the Scribbly page. But hopefully that's given you like a really good insight into the poem. You're feeling quite happy about it and you enjoy this one as well. So yeah, thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys soon.